Hello there, my sleepy knights. And tonight, we have a collection of Gandalf Tales. In the waning days of the Third Age, when the shadow had not yet grown to its full strength, but stirred restlessly in forgotten places, there came a time of strange disquiet in the northern lands beyond the Weather Hills. It was in those days that Gandalf the Grey, ever vigilant against the encroaching darkness, received tidings that troubled his mind deeply. The first whispers reached him in Rivendell, that ancient refuge of peace, where the murmur of falling water soothed weary hearts. There, as autumn winds stirred the golden leaves of trees, a ranger of the north brought word of curious happenings near the Eton moors. The dwarf miner, Gror Stonefist, has uncovered something in his delving, said the ranger. Not wealth, but woe. His company is beset by fear. Tools found broken at dawn, whispers in empty tunnels, and a coldness that seeps into bone and stone alike. Barely had this news settled in when a raven arrived bearing a message from Radagast the Brown. The bird spoke of men in the same region, a settlement led by one called Elfrida, suffering blight upon their fields and visions that walked in the mist at dusk. These are not common troubles, Gandalf mused, drawing deeply on his pipe beneath the star-swept sky. The Eton moors bear the old scars of Angmar, and some wounds in this world run deeper than sight can perceive. The wizard's eyes narrowed as he gazed northward. Two people suffering different torments, yet in the same place. This bears the mark of something stirred from long slumber. Without further delay, Gandalf set forth upon the North Road, his staff in hand and purpose in his stride. land changed as Gandalf approached the Eton Moors. Green hills gave way to stark, wind-scoured rises, where twisted trees clung desperately to thin soil. The very air seemed reluctant to move, hanging heavy with an unnatural stillness that pressed upon the mind like a physical weight. Gandalf felt it as he crested a ridge overlooking the troubled lands. A presence ancient and sorrowful, neither malevolent nor benign, but wounded and weeping in a voice too deep for ears to hear. It settled upon his thoughts like a shroud, making even his purpose seem momentarily distant and unclear. Yes, there is grief here, he murmured. Old grief, preserved like insects in amber, unchanging through the long years. In the distance, smoke rose from the dwarf mine on the eastern slopes, while to the west lay the huddled steadings of Elfrida's folk. Between them stretched a no-man's land of mist-shrouded rocks and skeletal trees, touched by an unnatural frost. Gandalf felt the tension between the two settlements, like a bowstring drawn taut, ready to loose its arrow into violence. With grim determination, he urged his mount forward into the Valley of Shadows. The mining camp of Gror Stonefest sprawled against the hillside, a collection of sturdy tents, rough wooden structures, and the yawning mouth of the mine itself. Dwarves moved about with uncharacteristic hesitation, their eyes darting, hands never straying far from weapon hilts. Garora himself stood like a weathered boulder, stout and unyielding despite the strain evident in his deep-set eyes. His beard, braided with silver clasps that spoke of better days, trembled slightly as he spoke. Wizard, he growled in greeting. The word neither welcome nor dismissal. What brings you to this accursed place? The accursedness itself, replied Gandalf mildly. I hear you have found more than ore in your digging, Master Gror. The dwarf's face darkened. Sabotage and ill fortune. The men down valley cast envious eyes upon our work. Perhaps they send their hedge wizardry against us or poison the very air. Yet, as he spoke these accusations, Gandalf observed how the dwarf's fingers worked nervously at his belt, how his kin exchanged wary glances among themselves as though each suspected the other of some nameless betrayal. Show me your mine, said Gandalf, his tone brooking no refusal. The main tunnel was broad and well made, after the fashion of dwarfs, with sturdy timber supports and walls that bore the marks of skilled stonecraft. Yet, as they ventured deeper, the weight of the mountain seemed to press more heavily upon the mind than the body. Shadows cast by their lamps danced too eagerly, stretching like grasping fingers along the walls. Do you feel it? Gandalf asked softly. The fear is not your own, though it finds purchase in your hearts. It remembers the fall of Khazad-dûm, and the darkness that awoke in the deep places, the betrayal of ancient days. Gror flinched as though struck. How do you know the shape of my dreams, wizard? Each night I see the shadows deepen. Feel the stone itself turn hostile beneath my touch. Gandalf placed his hand against the tunnel wall. The stone felt unnaturally cold, and beneath his fingers a faint tremor pulsed, like a distant, discordant heartbeat. Yes. Oh, there is something here. he said. Something old. Something broken. Across the valley, the steadings of men presented a different face of the same affliction. Wooden houses, huddled together as though for protection against the encroaching wilderness. Fields lay withered beneath a persistent frost that came and went without respect for the seasons. Children peered with frightened eyes from doorways, while adults moved in groups, never alone. Elfrida met Gandalf at the border of her settlement. A tall woman with eyes like flint and hair the color of autumn wheat. A sword hung at her hip, its hilt worn smooth from frequent grasping. The Grey Wanderer, she said. Have you come to end our suffering, or merely to witness it? That depends on its nature, replied Gandalf. Tell me, what have you seen? And as twilight deepened around them, Elfrida spoke of phantoms that walked in the mist. Soldiers in ancient armor, weeping women with hollow eyes, children who beckoned from the edge of sight before dissolving into the fog. She told of whispers that came on the night wind, speaking of betrayal and loss, of the dwarves as enemies who would bring doom upon them all. And there, she said, pointing to a nearby field where crops lay blackened by frost. There the earth rejects our seed. It remembers old blood spilled and will not forget. Gandalf moved among the afflicted folk, speaking gently to those most deeply touched by fear. A young girl described figures that watched her from the corners of her room. An old man showed hands that had grown suddenly arthritic, twisted like the roots of a tree. This is the same source that troubles the dwarves, Gandalf said at last. Though it manifests differently among your people, you feel the echo of Arnorian sorrow, a memory of kingdoms falling to Anmar's shadow. Then the dwarves must have disturbed some ancient evil, Elfrida declared. They must be driven from these lands before they unleash destruction upon us all. Peace, peace, said Gandalf sternly. That is the whisper of the affliction speaking through you, not wisdom. I must see what they have found before judgment can be made. It was in the deepest chamber of Gror's mind that the truth was revealed at last. After much persuasion and no small display of wizardly authority, the dwarf master led Gandalf down tunnels that grew increasingly ancient, until they came to a chamber that bore the unmistakable marks of craftsmanship far older than Gror's expedition. We found this place, sealed behind a wall of fitted stone, said Gror. His voice was hushed with reluctant awe, and within it, that. The light of Gandalf's staff illuminated a stone unlike any other, large as a smith's anvil, its surface neither fully crystalline nor wholly opaque. Ancient ruins spiraled across its surface in patterns that seemed to move when viewed from the corner of the eye. At its center, a fresh crack marred the intricate design, and from this wound emitted a faint, sickly luminescence. When did you break the seal? Gandalf asked. 3 moons past, replied Gror. We thought to find treasure, perhaps knowledge. Instead, he gestured helplessly at the stone. Gandalf approached carefully, holding his hand near the stone surface without touching it. Immediately, a wave of raw emotion assaulted his senses. Grief beyond measure, terror without name, rage without focus or purpose. It was not directed at him, but broadcast outward like heat from a forge. touching all within its reach. This is no simple stone, Gandalf said, his voice grave. This is a ward stone of Anor, crafted in the last days of that kingdom as Angmar's shadow lengthened across these lands. Such devices were made to absorb and contain the psychic trauma of war and despair, to prevent such emotions from poisoning the very land. Gror's face paled beneath his beard. We have broken it. Yes, said Gandalf. The damage has disrupted the containment ruins. Instead of holding the ancient sorrow, it now broadcasts it, finding resonance in your fears, in the anxieties of Elfrida's people, growing stronger as you grow more afraid. Can it be mended? Asked the dwarf. Perhaps, said Gandalf. Perhaps. But it will require what is in shortest supply between your peoples. Trust. The stone creates a cycle of fear, Gandalf explained as they exited the chamber. It projects the ancient sorrow it once contained. That sorrow finds echo in your present fears, which in turn strengthens the stone's broadcast. Like a cracked bell struck wrongly, its dissonance grows with each reverberation. Gror nodded slowly, his craftsman's mind grasping the mechanism even as his heart quailed at the implications. Then we face not merely phantoms, but our own fears made manifest. Yes, and it's spreading, Gandalf added. The longer this continues, the further its influence will reach, the deeper the distrust will grow, until blood is shed. As though summoned by his words, a cry echoed from outside the mine. They rushed forth to find a dwarf, pointing urgently toward the misty veil that separated the two settlements. Through swirling banks of unnatural fog, Gandalf perceived the unmistakable sounds of conflict. Shouts of anger and fear, the clash of metal on metal. Without hesitation, he strode forward, his staff blazing suddenly with white light that cut through the murk like a knife. In a rocky hollow, two groups had met by chance or dark design. Dwarves returning from a prospecting venture, and men from Elfrida's steedings on a hunting expedition. Yet, each saw the other through a veil of phantom illusion. To the men, the dwarves appeared as twisted, malevolent creatures with burning eyes and bloodied weapons. And to the dwarves, the men seemed to shift between human form and something orcish. Their movements jerky and threatening. A few had already fallen, though whether to wounds of steel or fear, Gandalf could not immediately tell. An arrow whistled past his ear as he approached. "Enough," he thundered, bringing his staff down upon the earth with a crack that echoed like doom through the hollow. Light exploded outward in a blinding flash, momentarily burning away both mist and illusion. In that instant of clarity, both sides faltered, each seeing the other truly for the first time. Not monsters, but frightened mortals with weapons raised in desperate self-defense. "Hold!" cried Gandalf, his voice carrying power that compelled obedience. "This is the work of the stone, turning you against one another through fear and false sight. Slowly, weapons lowered as confusion replaced battle rage. Bodies on the ground stirred, none dead, though several bore wounds that would need tending. "This will only worsen," Gandalf told them grimly, "unless the stone is mended. Such encounters will multiply until open war erupts between your peoples. A war fought against phantoms, yet with real blood spilled." It required all of Gandalf's considerable persuasive power to bring Gror and Elfrida together before the entrance to the mine. They stood stiffly, hands never straying far from weapons despite Gandalf's insistence on peace. "Feel it," Gandalf commanded, gesturing toward the mine entrance, where even at this distance, waves of ancient anguish rolled forth like heat from an opened furnace. "This is what afflicts you both, not each other, but the pain of those long dead, preserved and now released." Elfrida shuddered visibly as the sensation washed over her, a tide of grief that seemed to resonate with her own deepest fears for her people, her family, her home. It feels like the end of all things," she whispered. "Aye," agreed Gror, reluctantly. "Like the doom that comes to all dwarf realms in time. The certainty of final darkness." "It feeds on such thoughts," said Gandalf, "and it will continue to do so unless we act. The stone must be mended, its containment restored." "How?" Elfrida asked, her voice steady despite the pallor of her face. "The ruins were crafted by ancient Honorian stonemasons, working in concert with dwarf artisans," Gandalf explained. "The damage can be repaired only through similar cooperation. Dwarven craft to mend the physical crack, and the focused will of men to contain emanations once more." "You ask us to trust those who would steal our lands?" Elfrida demanded. "And you would have us rely on men who blame us for their every misfortune," countered Gror. "I ask you both to recognize the true enemy," said Gandalf. "Not each other, but the legacy of an ancient evil that would set you at each other's throats. Angmar sought to destroy both your peoples long ago. Would you complete its work now?" A long silence followed, broken only by the moaning of the wind across the blighted moors and the distant, discordant pulse emanating from the mine. And at last, grudgingly, both leaders nodded their assent. "What must be done then?" asked Gror. The preparations lasted through the night and into the following day. Under Gandalf's guidance, Gror selected his most skilled craftsmen, 5 dwarves with steady hands and strong hearts. They gathered their finest tools and prepared delicate inlays of silver and gold, studying the undamaged portions of the stone's ruins to understand their patterns. Meanwhile, Elfrida chose those among her people with the clearest voices and strongest wills. 5 men and women who would focus their thoughts into a chant of renewal and containment. They practiced under Gandalf's instruction, learning to project calm and resolve, even as waves of ancient sorrow washed over them. Both groups struggled against the stone's influence, which seemed to grow stronger as they prepared to challenge it. Hands trembled, voices faltered, and minds wandered down dark paths of doubt and despair. Gandalf moved between them, his presence a bulwark against the psychic tide, offering encouragement and subtle strengthening where needed most. "Remember," he told them, "the fear you feel is not yours alone. It belongs to centuries past. The battles long decided, to griefs that should lie at rest. You give it no new power when you recognize it for what it truly is." As twilight approached, all was finally ready. Gandalf led the chosen participants into the mine, down the winding tunnels, to the ancient chamber where the Sorrow Stone pulsed with malevolent energy. The air grew colder with each step deeper. The psychic pressure increased until speech itself became an effort of will. The stone seemed larger somehow, its crack wider. The sickly light pulsing in time with the hammering hearts of those who approached it. Around the edges of Gandalf's light, shadows moved with purpose. Phantom soldiers bearing grievous wounds, weeping children clutching empty cradles, lords of ancient lineage watching with hollowed eyes. "Begin," commanded Gandalf, planting his staff firmly upon the chamber floor. A sphere of clean light expanded outward, pushing back the worst of the apparitions, creating a space in which work might be possible. The dwarfs approached the stone first, swallowing their fear, tools held in white-knuckled grips. They began their work with delicate precision, fitting thin sheets of silver into the fractured surface, while reciting the ancient crafting verses of their kind. Words of binding and making that had not since changed from the first age of the world. And at the same time, the men formed a half circle between them and began their chant. Low at first, then swirling in volume and conviction. It was a song of peace after long struggle. Of wounds healed and sorrows accepted. Of lands renewed after desolation. Their voices echoed strangely in the chamber, seeming at some times to be joined by others unseen. Gandalf stood between two groups. The men and dwarfs, one hand extended toward each. His staff planted firmly before him. His eyes were closed in deep concentration. His lips moving silently as he wove together the separate workings into a cohesive whole. The stone resisted. As the first inlays took hold, the psychic emanations intensified tenfold. Spectral warriors materialized fully now, their faces contorted, weapons raised against enemies long vanquished. The temperature plummeted until breath frosted in the air, and fingers grew numb despite the proximity to Gandalf's light. A dwarf craftsman faltered as a wave of despair crashed over him. The certainty of failure. futility of all making in a world doomed to darkness. His hand shook violently, nearly marring the delicate silverwork. "Steady, Nari," Gandalf said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Remember the halls of your fathers, standing strong through the ages of the world. This darkness too shall pass." Among the men, a young woman's voice cracked and fell silent as visions of her own death played before her eyes. A future of ice and shadow swallowing the land she loved. "Sing, Aethel," Gandalf urged. "Your voice joins with those who sang before the making of the world. The shadow is memory only, and has no claim upon the future. Hour by hour, the work continued under terrible pressure. The dwarves inlaid the fracture with precious metals, inscribing microscopic ruins of containment and peace. The men maintained their chant despite hoarseness and exhaustion. Their combined will forming a barrier against the worst of the psychic onslaught. At last, as the final thread of gold was laid into place, the chant reached its crescendo. Gandalf stepped forward. He placed his hand gently over the repaired section of the stone and spoke a single word of power, not loud, but carrying the weight of authority that was his by nature and long service. The word meant peace. In a language older than the stone itself. For a moment, nothing changed. The apparitions pressed closer. The cold deepened, and the malevolent pulse of the stone continued unabated. Then, with the suddenness of a snapped bowstring, everything ceased. The spectral figures vanished. The unnatural cold dissipated. The sickly light emanating from the stone transformed, becoming a steady, neutral glow that illuminated the ruins without casting shadows. The psychic pressure that had weighed upon hearts and minds lifted, leaving behind a clean emptiness like the aftermath of a cleansing rain. The dwarves lowered their tools with trembling hands. The men's voices fell silent, their faces etched with exhaustion, yet lightened by wonder. Gandalf stood before the stone, now quiescent and contained, his own countenance reflecting both weariness and quiet satisfaction. "It is done," he said simply. "The stone once more contains that which it was meant to hold, harming none." Dawn broke clear and cold over the Eton moors as the participants emerged from the mine. The landscape seemed somehow less forbidding in the clean morning light, still harsh and windswept, but no longer suffused with malevolence. Gror and Elfrida stood before Gandalf, the shared ordeal having forged not friendship, perhaps, but a wary respect between them. "The chamber will be sealed again," said Gror, "with stronger wards than before. We will seek our fortune elsewhere in these hills." "And we will plant our fields anew," said Elfrida. "The blight should lift now that the stone sleeps once more." Gandalf regarded them both with eyes that had witnessed the rise and falls of kingdoms throughout the long ages of Middle-earth. "Remember what transpired here," he said. "Not all evils wear the face of an enemy. Sometimes the greatest danger lies in the shadows of memory and the wounds that never fully heal." He gathered his cloak and turned to depart, his task complete, yet his larger purpose ever ongoing. Behind him, dwarf and man stood in the dawn light, separate still, divided by history and nature, yet bound by an understanding forged in shared trial. The Sorrow Stone slumbered once more in darkness, its burden contained its lesson delivered to those with wisdom to heed it. And Gandalf the Grey walked onward. For in those days the shadow grew ever longer across the lands of Middle-earth, and there were many such forgotten pearls yet to be faced before the ending of the age. In the deepening twilight of a bitter autumn day, Gandalf the Grey urged his steed through the mists of ruin. The ancient lands east of the Iron Hills lay shrouded in a perpetual haze. Yet, today, the fog seemed to possess a malevolent weight. Clinging to his grey robes like grasping fingers. His heart grew heavier with each league that passed beneath Shadowfax's swift hoofs. For he had received tidings which brooked no delay. Aldemir the Wise, keeper of ancient lore, and steadfast friend through 3 ages of Middle-earth, lay grievously wounded in his remote dwelling. The humble cottage appeared before him like a shadow taking form in the mist. Once, herbs and healing plants had grown in neat beds beside its weathered walls. But now they lay withered and black, as though scorched by some fell power. The very air seemed to recoil from what had transpired here, and Gandalf's grip tightened upon his staff as he dismounted. Aldemir, he called softly, pushing open the door. The interior was dark, save for a single guttering candle, its flame dancing weakly against shadows that seemed too deep, too purposeful to be natural. And upon a bed, a simple bed, lay a figure that Gandalf barely recognized. So greatly had pain and injury transformed his old friend. You have come. Aldemir's voice was but a whisper, yet relief shone in his friendly eyes. I feared the darkness would claim me before. Save your strength, Gandalf said, kneeling beside the bed. keen eyes took in the nature of Aldemir's wounds. Not mere cuts or bruises, but marks of dark sorcery that ate both flesh and spirit. Who has done this? Aldemir's hand clutched at Gandalf's sleeve. "Pray gone," he gasped, and Gandalf felt his blood run cold at the name of one who had once been counted among their most trusted circle. He came 3 nights past, but not alone. He brings with him what, old friend? What has Bregon taken up that could work such evil? The black shard of Dol Guldur. The words seemed to dim the candle's flame, and Gandalf drew in a sharp breath. Found in the ruins after the necromancer's defeat. Its power whispered to him, promised him strength to prevent the doom he claims to have foreseen. Aldemir's voice grew weaker, each word clearly causing him great pain. But it is corruption. Mithrandir, nothing but corruption. Be still, Gandalf murmured. But Aldemir would not be silenced. You must bear my body to the grove of the Ents, he insisted, his grip surprisingly strong. The ancient magics there, they must guard what remains of my knowledge, my memories within me. The grove's power can prevent. He was racked by a spasm of pain. Prevent what lies within me from being twisted by the shard's influence, even after death. I will see it done, my old friend, Gandalf promised. But Aldemir was not finished. Beware him, Mithrandir. Beware what Bregon has become. The shard's power grows, feeds upon itself. He believes he acts for good, but the darkness. His voice failed him, and Gandalf could see the last of his strength ebbing away. Rest now, Rest, he said softly, taking Aldemir's hand. You have fought long and well. Aldemir's eyes focused one last time, bright with urgent purpose. Swear to me, he whispered. Swear by the light of the Valar that you will see this done, Gandalf. I so swear, Gandalf replied. By all the Valar, I will see your last wish fulfilled. And I will deal with what Dragon has wrought. A final, peaceful smile touched Aldemir's lips. And then he was gone. For a long moment, Gandalf remained motionless, his head bowed. When at last he rose, there was in his bearing something terrible to behold. Grief transformed into purpose, and judgment tempered by wisdom to something all the more fearsome for its restraint. Rest now, Keeper of Lore, he said softly, drawing his cloak over the still form. The journey ahead is mine to make. He turned to the door, his staff blazing suddenly with white fire that drove back the unnatural shadows. And you, Bragon, he added, shall answer for what you have done. Dawn brought no comfort to the shadowed lands. Gandalf secured Aldemir's body to the back of Shadowfax. The burden he bore was both physical and spiritual, for he could sense the lingering corruption attempting to seep into his friend's remains. Held at bay only by arts older than the realm of Gondor itself. The path before him led through lands that had once been fair. In days long past when the dominion of Sauron had not reached so far. Now, the very earth seemed to remember ancient wounds. The trees grew twisted, their bark bearing strange marks like burns that formed patterns too regular to be natural. Here and there, ancient standing stones that had once marked the boundaries of forgotten kingdoms now bore fresh ruins, black and terrible, that made even Gandalf's eyes ache to look upon them. Shadowfax moved uneasily beneath him, the great horse's instincts warning of corruption in the very air. The mists had thinned, but in their place came a chill that spoke of malice rather than nature's touch. Thrice they passed clearings where the grass had withered in perfect circles, and at their centers lay crystals that had been shattered, as though someone had conducted dark rituals and then destroyed the evidence of their working. You leave clear signs, Bragon, Gandalf murmured, dismounting to examine one such circle. Though perhaps not the ones you think. His fingers traced the air above the blackened grass, reading the residue of power like a scholar might read an ancient text. The black shard's influence grows indeed, marking you as surely as you mark these lands. At last, as the sun climbed toward noon, they came upon a place where the corruption could no longer be mistaken. The trees drew back from a great circular space, their branches twisting away as though in terror. And at its very center stood a figure in robes that had once been white, but now seemed stained with shadows that moved of their own accord. I wondered when you would come, Mithran dear. Bragan's voice was still his own, yet it carried undertones that made the air itself seem to shiver. He turned, and Gandalf saw that his once friend's face was pale as death, save for his eyes, which burned with an unnatural light. Have you come to stop me, as poor Aldemir tried to do? I have come because you have strayed into darkness, Bregon, Gandalf replied. Because you have betrayed not only your friend, but your own wisdom. Bregon laughed, a sound with too many echoes. Wisdom. I have seen what comes, Gandalf. I have seen it in visions, granted by the shard's power. A darkness greater than Sauron approaches, and the old ways, the cautious ways, will not be enough to stand against it. And so you turn to the very power you claim to stand against, Gandalf said, taking a step forward. How many times must this lesson be learned? The rings of power, the Palantir, now this shard of ancient malice, all tools that promise salvation through power, all corrupting those who claimed they could master them. You understand nothing. Bregon's voice rose again, and with it rose a wind that carried the scent of decay. I have mastered this power. The corruption of what you speak is nothing more than the weakness of lesser minds. With this shard's strength, you can what? Gandalf interrupted, his own voice now terrible and commanding. Save Middle-earth by destroying all that makes it worth saving. Yes, I see your signs of mastery all around us. Bregon. I see it in these blighted lands, in these dark ruins that speak of domination rather than protection. I see it in what you did to Aldemir. And at the mention of that name, something flickered in Bregon's burning eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or pain, quickly masked. That old fool would not listen. He would have stopped what must be done. I tried to make him understand. You tried to force your will upon him, as you will now try to force your will upon the very fabric of Middle-earth itself. But some things Some things cannot be forced, Bragon. Some powers cannot be mastered. They can only master you, all the while letting you believe you remain in control. Bragon's response came not in words, but in power. The black shard flared at his breast, and darkness erupted from his outstretched hands like a tide of night itself. A malevolent energy crackled through the air, and trees twisted and groaned as though in pain. But Gandalf stood unmoved, his staff blazing with white fire. "I am a servant of the secret fire," he declared, his voice rolling like thunder. "Wielder of the flame of Anor." The darkness broke against his light, like waves upon a mighty cliff. And in that moment, he seemed to grow taller, more terrible in his wrath. Bragon snarled and drew upon deeper powers. The ground itself heaved and cracked, and from the fissures rose writhing shadows. Shadows that took the forms of fell creatures. Yet each shadow that approached Gandalf's circle of light dissolved like mist before the dawn. The battle of powers raged on. Light against dark, wisdom against corrupted knowledge. Enough. Gandalf brought his staff down with a crack that echoed like the breaking of the world. Words of power, ancient beyond reckoning, rolled from his tongue. Not the black speech that Bragon had turned to, but something older still. Words that had been spoken when the world was young and the first stars were kindled. The light from his staff transformed into chains of pure radiance that wrapped around Bragon, binding not just his physical form, but the very power he had tried to master. The black shard's glow dimmed, though it could not be fully quenched, and Bragon fell to his knees, gasping. "You are bound," Gandalf said. "Not by hatred, but by duty. You shall carry Aldemir's body to his final rest, and in that journey find what wisdom you have forgotten." He approached the kneeling figure, who looked up with eyes that showed fear beneath their burning. "This is both your punishment and your chance for redemption, if you have the courage to take it." And with that, Gandalf placed Aldemir's body in the arms of his killer. East they journeyed, bearing their solemn burden through lands that grew ever stranger and more fell. The path to the Grove of the Ents led through ancient forests where trees had forgotten their true nature, their branches reaching down like grasping hands. Bragon walked ahead, struggling to carry Aldemir's body, bound by Gandalf's power, while Shadowfax followed behind. In places, they passed the ruins of what had once been fair halls of the Firstborn, now reduced to tumbled stone and broken archways. Black moss grew thick upon the white stones, forming patterns that seemed almost like writing in some dark tongue. "Your handiwork, in part," Gandalf said, as they paused before a once beautiful fountain, its waters now black and still as pitch. "The shard's corruption spreads from you like ripples in a pool, tainting all it touches." Bragon stood silent for a moment, struggling with Aldemir's heavy body, staring at his reflection in the dark water. "You see corruption," he said at last, "where I see necessity. The power must be mastered, else we shall have no defense against what comes." "And what of those who fall in the meantime? What of Aldemir, whose body you now bear? Was his death necessary also?" They passed through a grove where every tree wept black sap, the drops falling like tears onto the withered grass below. Here and there, they glimpsed figures in the shadows. Not living things, but echoes of dark magic, spectral forms that flitted just at the edge of vision. The path to the grove grows more treacherous, Bragon observed, his voice strained by the weight of Aldemir's body. The old powers resist us. They resist what you have become, Gandalf corrected. The powers of Middle-earth remember, Bragon. They remember what you were, and what you might have been. As evening approached, they made camp in the ruins of what had once been a way station for travelers. Though its walls now bore the same dark ruins they had seen throughout their journey, while Shadowfax stood guard over Aldemir's body, Gandalf and Bragon sat before a small fire. Though Bragon could not help but notice that its light seemed to push back the shadows with more force than natural flame should possess. "Tell me," Gandalf said at last, breaking a long silence. "What vision was worth betraying all you once held dear?" "You speak of betrayal," Bragon replied. "Yet you would have us remain bound by old oaths and ancient limitations, where darkness gathers strength. I have seen what approaches, Mithrandir. I have seen it in dreams sent by the Shard. Dreams sent by the Shard," Gandalf interrupted. "Do you not hear your own words? Since when do true visions come from ancient artifacts of darkness?" "Since we lost the strength to face our enemies," Bragon's voice rose, and with it came a stirring in the shadows around them. "The time of the elves is ending. The power of the wizards wanes. Who then shall stand against what comes, if not those willing to take up whatever weapons we can find?" "And this is what you have become, a taker of weapons, a wielder of borrowed power. Gandalf's eyes were keen in the firelight. Tell me, when did Bregon the Wise forsake wisdom for mere strength? When did the Guardian become a gatherer of dark trinkets? You speak of wisdom, Bregon said. But there was something less certain in his voice now. Yet, what is wisdom without the power to preserve what we guard? What good are all our ancient scrolls and noble words if darkness devours all? Ah, said Gandalf softly. Now we come to it. You fear powerlessness more than you fear corruption. Yet consider this. Aldemir died with honor, holding to his principles until the very end, while you He let the words hang in the air between them. Bregon turned away, but not before Gandalf saw something flicker in his eyes. Something that might have been shame, quickly masked by anger. Honor will not save Middle-earth, he muttered. The words, well, the words sounded hollow, as though he were trying to convince himself as much as Gandalf. Dawn brought no respite from the growing darkness. As they ventured deeper into the shadow-haunted woods, shapes began to coalesce from the mists. Twisted forms that had once been creatures of Middle-earth before the Black Shard's influence corrupted them. Wolves with eyes that burned like coals padded between the trees, their fur matted with something that looked unsettlingly like the black moss from the ruins. Above them, creatures that might once have been ravens wheeled on wings that seemed to drink in what little light filtered through the canopy. They came in answer to the Shard's call, Bregon said. did not know its influence had spread so far. Did you not? Gandalf's voice was stern. Or did you choose not to see? Before Bragon could answer, the first of the shadow wolves attacked. It came without a sound, a darkness detaching itself from darkness. Jaws aimed at Shadowfax's throat. Gandalf's staff flared, and the creature recoiled with a howl that echoed unnaturally through the trees. More shapes emerged from the shadows. Not just wolves now. No. Things that crawled on too many legs. And others that seemed to shift form even as they moved. Stand fast, Gandalf commanded, as the creatures encircled them. They seek Aldemir's remains, the last uncorrupted power they can sense in these woods. Bragon's hands twitched, and Gandalf could sense him yearning to draw upon the shard's power. But the binding held, and instead, he was forced to face the approaching horrors with only his own strength. A wolf leaped for him, and he barely managed to deflect it with his staff. His ordinary staff, not the channel of dark power the shard had made it. How does it feel? Gandalf called, as he drove back 3 creatures with a blast of white fire. To face the fruits of your labors without hiding behind borrowed power. Bragon did not answer. Too busy defending himself. But in his eyes, Gandalf could see the horror growing as he truly beheld what his actions had wrought. These creatures had once been pure, natural things. Their corruption lay at his feet. The battle pressed closer. Shadowfax reared, his hoofs striking out with deadly accuracy at any shadow thing that dared approach Aldemir's body. Gandalf's power blazed like a star fallen to earth, driven back by the darkness. And Bragon fought with growing desperation, yet also with growing purpose. When a twisted thing, that had once been a deer charged him, its antlers dripping black corruption. He met it with a cry that held no darkness, only clean determination. At last, as suddenly as they had appeared, the shadow creatures melted away, leaving behind only an unnatural silence and the lingering stench of corruption. Rhaegon stood trembling, bearing cuts and bruises from the fight. Gandalf carried Eldamir's remains to him. We must continue. At last, as the sun rose on the 5th day of their journey, the grove of the Ents lay before them. Here, at last, was a place untouched by shadow. Ancient trees rose like pillars of a great cathedral, their leaves gold and russet in the autumn light. The air seemed to shimmer with power here, not the harsh, demanding force of the black shard, but something deeper, something more fundamental to the very bones of Middle-earth. Yes, the old songs still live here, Gandalf said softly, as they passed between two great oaks that seemed to bow slightly in greeting. This is one of the last places where the first music of creation still can be heard. Even Rhaegon fell silent in wonder. Eldamir's body heavy in his hands. The grass beneath their feet was soft and green, untouched by corruption. And in the branches above, birds sang melodies that seemed almost to form words in some ancient tongue. Here and there, among the trees, they glimpsed the slow-moving forms of Ents, as ancient as the grove itself. Their eyes, deep with the wisdom of countless seasons. But their moment of peace was not to last. The first warning came as a shadow passing over the sun, too large to be a cloud, too purposeful to be natural. Then came a sound that shook the very leaves, the beat of vast wings, and a roar that spoke of corruption given form and fury. A drake of the ancient world, Gandalf breathed, raising his staff. Twisted by the darkness you awakened, Bragon. The dragon descended like a storm made flesh. Its scales black as obsidian, but streaked with veins of sickly green light that pulsed in rhythm with the black shard. Behind it came other shapes, shadow creatures like those they had fought before, but larger now, more fully formed, as though the dragon's presence gave them greater substance. The Ents began to move, their slow deliberation transformed into terrible purpose as they faced this threat to their sacred grove. But the dragon's corruption was potent. Where its shadow fell, even the ancient trees seemed to shudder and dim. The grove must not fall. Gandalf's voice rang out as he stood forth, his staff blazing with white fire. The dragon banked sharply, breathing forth not natural flame, but a stream of darkness that seemed to devour the very light. Gandalf met it with a counter spell that turned the darkness aside. But the effort cost him greatly. The battle raged beneath the ancient boughs, light against shadow, preservation against corruption. The Ents moved with terrible purpose, their mighty limbs crushing shadow creatures. But even their ancient strength began to falter before the dragon's poisonous presence. Gandalf stood like a beacon of defiance, his power a shield over Aldemir's body. But even he could not stand forever against such darkness. Bragon watched, torn between ancient loyalties and the seductive whisper of the black shard, which grew stronger in the dragon's presence. The binding spell that Gandalf had placed upon him began to crack under the pressure of so much concentrated darkness. Then came the moment that changed everything. The dragon, sensing Gandalf's fatigue, loosed a blast of corrupted flame directly at Aldemir's body. And in that instant, Rhaegon saw Aldemir's face in his mind, not as he had last seen him, twisted in pain and betrayal, but as he had always been, wise, kind, and unfailingly true to his principles. The binding spell shattered, but not in the way the dragon's power had intended. Instead of reaching for the black shard's darkness, Rhaegon reached for something older, deeper. The memory of who he had been before power had corrupted him. And with a cry that held no magic, but spoke of choice and redemption, he threw himself between the dragon's blast and Aldemir's remains. The impact threw him to the ground, the corruption burning through him. But in choosing to shield rather than destroy, to protect rather than dominate, something fundamental shifted. The black shard's hold over him cracked, and in that crack, light poured through. The pure, ancient light of the grove itself. No, Mithrandir. No. Rhaegon gasped through his pain. While the connection is broken, Gandalf seized the moment. Power blazed from his staff like the first light of creation, catching the dragon in mid-roar. The beast's corruption, fed for so long by its link to the black shard, began to unravel as that link was severed by Bregan's choice. In the aftermath of battle, the grove's ancient power began to heal itself. Golden light spreading through the leaves like dawn after a long night. The Ents gathered in a solemn circle round the place chosen for Aldemir's rest. a hollow between the roots of 3 great trees, whose branches had grown together over centuries to form a natural sanctuary. Gandalf spoke the words of passing in the ancient tongue. The Ents added their own deep harmonies, song of earth and root, and lasting memory. As they laid Aldemir's body in its final resting place, flowers of white and gold sprouted from the earth, their little petals glowing with a light that seemed to answer the stars themselves. Bragon stood apart, the black shard now dormant at his feet like a burned-out coal. His face bore new lines of wisdom and grief, but his eyes were clear for the first time since darkness had first whispered to him of power. The road ahead of you will not be easy, Gandalf said, approaching him. The path from darkness never is. No, Bragon agreed quietly. But it is the right path. I see that now. He looked toward Aldemir's grave, where the luminous flowers continued to bloom. He tried to tell me, at the end, about the difference between power and strength. And now I understand what he meant. Bragon knelt and picked up the black shard, and with deliberate care he placed it upon a stone by Aldemir's grave. The Ents would guard it, ensuring it would never corrupt another soul. As dawn broke over the grove, the two parted ways. Gandalf to his eternal vigilance over Middle-earth, and Bragon to a solitary path of penance. Among the ancient trees, Aldemir rested in peace, his wisdom preserved in the living memory of the grove, while above, the morning stars faded into a sky washed clean of shadow. In the waning days of autumn, when the mists clung to the peaks of the iron hills like grasping fingers of despair, Gandalf the Grey received tidings that filled his heart with foreboding. The message had come by raven from Gror the Elder, Lord of the Iron Hills, and its words were stark in their simplicity. Mithrandir, our axes break against shadow. Our shields fail us. Come, if friendship means aught to you. The wizard, urged by Shadowfax, through the treacherous passes, his grey robes billowing in the bitter wind that carried upon it the scent of fear and failing hope. As he climbed higher into the domain of Durin's folk, the very stone seemed to whisper of a malevolence that had crept into the ancient halls, like poison seeping through rock. The gates of the Iron Hills' greatest stronghold stood open before him. Their massive oak doors of iron and oak, bearing fresh scars that spoke of desperate battles recently fought. The great hinges, wrought by master craftsmen in ages past, hung twisted and blackened, as though dragon fire had licked at them. No songs echoed from the halls within, no ring of hammer on anvil, only a silence that sat heavy as a shroud upon the mountain's heart. Gandalf! The voice that greeted him belonged to Gror the Elder. But the dwarf who approached him bore little resemblance to the proud lord the wizard remembered. His beard, once copper bright as the very ore his people mined, was now streaked with premature silver, and his eyes held the haunted look of one who has watched his people's strength crumble like sand through grasping fingers. What darkness has touched your halls, old friend? Gandalf asked, dismounting and placing a comforting hand upon the dwarf lord's shoulder. Come, Gror said simply. See for yourself what we face, and judge whether hope remains to us. They descended deep into the mountain's heart, past chambers where dwarfen craftsmen sat idle beside cold forges, their tools scattered and broken like the dreams of their makers. The workshops that had once rung with the sound of creation now stood silent as tombs, their anvils cracked and their bellows hanging slack. At last, they came to a vast armory where the finest weapons and armor of the Iron Hills had once been displayed. Now, the chamber told of a tale of ruin that spoke louder than any lament. Swords lay shattered, their edges eaten away as though by some corrosive poison. Mail shirts hung in tatters, links dissolving at the merest touch. Even the mighty warhammers of the dwarf lords bore cracks that ran deep into their hearts of steel. "Behold, the work of Gundabad," Gror said. "But not the orcs alone. They come now with a lieutenant of Dol Guldur, one who wields sorceries that make our craftwork crumble like autumn leaves." Gandalf knelt beside a broken blade, his keen eyes reading the signs of corruption that had eaten through the dwarf's steel, like acid through flesh. "Dark magic indeed," he murmured, feeling the lingering malevolence that clung to the ruined metal. "And your forges cannot overcome this taint?" "We have tried," came a new voice from the shadows. An ancient dwarf emerged, his beard white as mountain snow, and his eyes dim with years beyond counting. "I am Runi, last heir to the secrets of Az-Sagal, the Dragon Slayer. Our forges burn as hot as dragon fire, yet still the darkness proves stronger." The old dwarf approached with trembling hands towards a pedestal that stood empty in the chamber's heart. "Here stood the axe of unyielding, forged by Tharin the First himself, in the deeps of Khazad-dûm. 3 days passed, shattered in the hands of our greatest warrior, as he faced the lieutenant's sorcery. And without it?" Gandalf asked. "Our people lose heart," Gror replied. "They say the old strength is gone from us, that we are become weak as the race of men. Some speak of abandoning the Iron Hills entirely." It was then that Runi produced from his robes a scroll of ancient vellum. "Yet, in our darkest hour, the old lore has yielded up a secret long buried. This I found 3 nights past, in the deepest archives." Gandalf took the scroll with reverent care, his eyes scanning the ancient ruins. "The anvil of Tharin the First," he read aloud. "Forged with the aid of Aule's own fires, blessed by the Valar themselves. Weapons made upon this anvil shall know no corruption. Broken blades may be forged stronger than before. But it is lost, Gror said heavily. Hidden away in Tharin's experimental delve, high in the most treacherous peaks. Rooney shook his head. Not lost, my lord. Guarded. Our scouts have found the delve. And they have found what guards it now. Obsidian scale. Ur-Dugul in the old tongue. A dragon of the ancient world. Cunning beyond measure. And cruel as winter's bite. The fire that burned in the great hearth cast dancing shadows as Rooney continued. The scouts spoke of scales like polished obsidian, drinking in light and giving back only darkness. Its fire burns with a heat that speaks of the very pits of Angband, where its breath touches stone. The rock runs like water. I have walked in the world for many years, Gandalf said. I have seen the great drakes in their pride and witnessed their fall. There may be another way. Not sword and spear, but cunning and wisdom. The old lore speaks of methods used against dragons in the elder days. All eyes turned to him, and in their depths he saw the first glimmer of hope that had shone in the Iron Hills for many days. I will need time to consult the archives of memory, Gandalf continued, to delve into lore that has not been spoken aloud since Gil-galad held the Havens. And I will need brave hearts, willing to venture into shadow. We shall have whatever aid we can give, Gror said at once. Our finest warriors, not warriors, Gandalf interrupted. Not warriors. No, this task calls for different virtues. I will need those skilled in stealth and strength and craft. Those who can move like whispers and work like shadows. It is said that Gandalf spent 3 days in preparation, sometimes walking alone in the high places, where the wind sang songs of the ancient world, sometimes with Rooney in chambers deep beneath the mountain, where the oldest lore was kept. when at last he emerged, his grey robe seemed to shimmer with purpose, and his staff bore new ruins that glowed with soft, silver light. "I have found a way," he announced to the assembled dwarf lords. "In the archives of Rivendell, Elrond preserves a scroll that speaks of the breath of slumber, a compound known to the wise in Valinor, used in the elder days to still the rage of dragons when diplomacy might yet serve. You would make it sleep?" asked Borin Stonebeard, the master engineer, his scarred face bearing an expression of disbelief mixed with dawning hope. "Yes, precisely. Now, the recipe calls for moon petals from the hidden glades of the Misty Mountains, crystals that sing with the music of deep waters, and the dew of dream leaf gathered at the dark of the moon. Now these I can obtain, but the delivery..." His eyes turned to Borin. "That will require all your craft." The dwarf engineer's eyes gleamed with sudden understanding. The air currents in the delve, if we could map them precisely, construct a system to carry the vapors to where the dragon lies. But we will need others for the task that follows. I ask for volunteers, not for glory or gold, but for a mission that may well mean death. From the shadows stepped a figure, slight of build, but strong of spirit. Dees the Swift had earned her name in the deep tunnels where speed and silence meant the difference between life and death. Her dark eyes held no fear, only steady determination. "I will go," she said simply. "My hands are small and quick. My feet as silent as falling snow. If the anvil can be taken without waking the beast, I can take it." "And I," came another voice. Feely the keen-eyed stepped forward, grey-bearded and sharp of sight, whose memory held the plans of every tunnel delved in the Iron Hills for 3 centuries. "I know the old delve. I was there when my grandfather sealed it. The ways are treacherous, but I can guide us through." Gandalf studied the volunteers with eyes that seemed to look right into their very souls. "Then we have our company. These souls will attempt what armies could not accomplish. But know this, what we undertake goes against every instinct of honorable battle. We go not as warriors, but as thieves in the night. The moon was dark when Gandalf and his chosen companions set forth from the Iron Hills. Their path, leading ever upward through passes that grew more treacherous with each mile. Behind them, the lights of the dwarf halls dwindled to distant stars, while ahead lay the wild country, where few dared venture even in times of peace. Boren had worked tirelessly to craft the apparatus they would need. A system of leather bellows, segmented tubes that could be assembled swiftly and in silence. The tubes themselves were works of art, fashioned from the finest materials and sealed with runes that would prevent the precious vapors from escaping. In his pouches, Gandalf carried the components of the breath of slumber. The moon petals had been gathered from a hidden vale in the misty mountains, where they bloomed only in starlight. Their silver radiance dimmed now, but their power undiminished. The singing crystals had been found in caves, where underground streams played eternal music. Most precious of all was the dream leaf dew, each drop worth more than gold, distilled from the tears of trees that remembered the first sunrise. For 2 days they climbed, pausing only when exhaustion demanded rest, or when Feli's experienced eye detected signs of landslide ahead. The paths grew narrower and more treacherous, carved from living rock in ages past, but weathered now by centuries of rain and wind. The weather grew steadily worse as they climbed higher, as though the very elements conspired against their mission. Snow began to fall on the second day, hard driving particles that cut like tiny knives and made every step a battle against the wind. On the second night, as they sheltered in a cave scarcely large enough for their company, Dee spoke in the darkness. "Tell us of this dragon, Mithrandir. What manner of creature are we to face?" Gandalf was silent for a long moment, his eyes lost in contemplation of memories stretched back to the elder days. Ur-Dugul is ancient among dragons, spawned in the fires of Angband, when Morgoth still walked in flesh upon Middle-earth. 'Tis a cunning serpent, proud and utterly without mercy. Yet, it is still a creature of flesh and spirit, and thus may be touched by the arts of those who serve the secret fire. You speak as one who has faced dragons before, Borin observed. I have walked in the world for many years, Gandalf replied. I have seen the great drakes in their pride, and witnessed their fall. They are creatures of consuming hunger, not merely for gold, but for dominion itself. This makes them powerful, but it also makes them predictable. On the third dawn, they reached the approach to Tharin's Lost Delve. The entrance gaped before them like a wound in the mountainside, its edges blackened by dragon fire, and its depths shrouded in darkness that seemed almost alive. Here, we must part for a time, Gandalf said softly. Borin, take your apparatus to that ridge, where you can observe the air currents. Dees and Fili remain hidden but ready. When the dragon sleeps, you will have but moments to act. And if your sorcery fails, Dees asked, her hand resting on her dagger's hilt. Then flee, Gandalf replied simply. Live to carry word back to your people, that they might find another way. And so, it was said, alone, the wizard approached the dragon's lair. With infinite care, he prepared the breath of slumber, mixing the ancient components according to lore learned in halls that mortals had never seen. The moon petals dissolved like mist. The crystals sang their silent song, and the dream leaf dew bound it all together with threads of silver light. From deep within the delve came a sound that made the mountain itself tremble. The breathing of something vast and ancient and filled with malevolent intelligence. Each exhalation carried the scent of sulfur and burning metal, while each inhalation drew the very warmth from the air. Gandalf began to sing. His voice was soft at first, barely a whisper that seemed to blend with the mountain wind. But as he sang, power flowed through the words. Not the harsh dominion of the enemy, but something older and deeper. The music that had shaped the world in its very first creation. As Borin's bellows sent the vapors deep into the delve, Gandalf's song grew stronger. Chant so ancient seemed woven from starlight, and the sigh of winds over forgotten peaks filled the air, speaking of peace and rest, of dreams deeper than the roots of mountains, and sleep more profound than death. His staff began to glow with soft silver radiance. The very air grew still. Even the distant rumble of the dragon's breathing seemed to quiet, hushed by the profound peace emanating from the wizard. And then, from the depths, came a rumble as Ur-Dugul stirred, disturbed by the strange new scents and sounds. Gandalf felt its ancient mind brush against his own, a touch like molten iron that would have slain a lesser being instantly. But the wizard held firm, pouring all his will into the song of slumber. The vapors swirled deeper, carrying with them the essence of every lullaby ever sung, every gentle hand that had soothed a child to sleep. Deep in the heart of the mountain, the rock itself glowed red with reflected heat. Ur-Dugul lay coiled about its hoard, like a serpent embracing the sun. The dragon was magnificent and terrible to behold. Scales of deepest black that seemed to drink in light, eyes like crimson stars that had witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms. A presence that spoke of power beyond mortal comprehension. Upon the greatest pile of treasure, used as a pillow for the drake's massive head, lay the anvil of Tharin. The dragon had claimed it not for gold's sake, but because its power called to the creature's ancient malice. Here was a tool that could forge weapons to thwart darkness. And so, Ur-Dugul kept it close, denying its use to any who might stand against shadow. Even surrounded by gold and jewels beyond counting, it stood apart, a work of such craft and beauty that it seemed to sing with its own inner light. The dragon's great eye opened. A baleful crimson orb that fixed upon the entrance to its lair. Something had disturbed its eternal vigil. Some new scent carried on the mountain air. Its massive head rose from its bed of gold, nostrils flaring as it tasted the strange vapors that flowed like mist through its domain. For a moment, Ur-Dugul tensed, its ancient mind probing for threats. The song that echoed from the entrance was unlike anything it had ever heard. Not the war chants of attacking armies, the death screams of the conquered, but something that spoke to the depths of its being that had long been buried beneath centuries of greed and malice. The melody seemed to reach into the very core of the dragon's spirit, touching memories so ancient they predated its corruption. The vapors of the breath of slumber swirled around its massive form, carrying with them the essence of every gentle dream ever dreamed. The dragon's head began to droop, despite its efforts to maintain vigilance. Its eyes, which burned like stars for 3,000 years, grew heavy with weariness. Weariness that seemed to seep into its very bones. The great wings that could darken the sky folded against its sides, like petals closing at sunset. With a sigh that shook dust from the cavern ceiling, Ur-Dagul sank into slumber deeper than any it had known since its first hatching in the pits of Angband. Outside, Gandalf felt the moment when the dragon's will finally surrendered to the power. His song grew softer, though he dared not let it cease entirely. And with careful gestures he signaled to his companions, hidden among the rocks. These moved like a shadow given form, her feet finding purchase on stones would have betrayed a heavier tread. Behind her came Fili, his experienced eye reading the ancient passages by touch as much as sight. Together, they slipped to the dragon's lair, their hearts pounding with terror and determination in equal measure. The heat within the delve was overwhelming, like standing too close to a forge fire. The very air seemed to burn their lungs, and sweat ran down their faces in streams. But they pressed on, guided by Fili's knowledge of the old paths and Dee's uncanny ability to move without sound. The dragon horde was vast beyond imagination. Gold from treasuries of fallen kingdoms lay scattered like sand upon the cavern floor. Jewels that had once adorned the crowns of kings caught what little light there was and threw it back in rainbow fragments. And in the center of it all, beneath the sleeping head of Ur-Dagul, lay the anvil of Thrain. Working with infinite care, they began to create a path through the horde. Gold coins were lifted one by one, set aside in perfect silence. Jeweled cups were relocated with movements so gentle they seemed like caresses. Step by tiny step, they approached their goal. The work was agony. Every few moments, they had to freeze as Ur-Dagul stirred in its sleep, its massive form shifting in ways that sent avalanches of treasure cascading across the cavern floor. More than once, Dees was certain they had been discovered, that the great eye would open and their quest would end in fire and death. At last, they reached the anvil. Up close, it was even more magnificent than the legends had suggested. The sacred hammerhead was carved from a single block of star metal, surface covered with runes that seemed to move and shift in the dim light. "Now comes the true test," Feely whispered. "Together, on my count. 1, 2. They lifted. The anvil was heavier than stone, heavier than iron, but it moved, rising slowly from its resting place. As the two dwarves strained with every fiber of their being, the dragon stirred. Ur-Dagul's great head shifted, and one crimson eye crackled open like the first gleam of a fell dawn. For a heartbeat that seemed to last an eternity, dragon and dwarfs stared at each other across the glittering horde. Then, Gandalf's voice rang out from the cavern mouth, no longer soft and soothing, but terrible with command. Words of ancient power rolled from his tongue, and with them came a flash of silver that drove back the dragon's awakening consciousness. "Away, now, my brave dwarfs. Do not look back." Dees and Feely ran. The anvil clutched between them, their feet slipping and sliding on the treasure-strewn floor. Behind them came a roar that shook the mountain to its roots. Ur-Dagul, fully awakened and filled with incandescent rage. Dragonfire erupted from the depths of the delve, turning stone to slag and metal to vapor. But Gandalf was ready, his staff blazing with white light as he wove a barrier of power across the entrance. The flames broke against his defense like waves upon a cliff. "Into the pass," he commanded. "Quickly, before it breaks free." They fled down the mountainside as Ur-Dagul raged behind them. The dragon's fury echoing across the peaks like thunder. Twice the beast attempted to follow, but each time Gandalf's spells turned it back. The narrowness of the passages and the wizard's cunning defenses forced the creature back into its violated lair. Dawn was breaking over the Iron Hills when the small company finally reached safety. The Anvil of Thrar, borne in triumph through the gates of Gror's stronghold. Word of their success spread through the halls like wildfire, and soon every dwarf in the mountain had come to see the legendary artifact that had been wrestled from the dragon's hoard. The anvil was set in place in the great forge hall. and even before the first hammer fell upon its surface, its presence seemed to transform the very air. The defeated looks faded from dwarf faces, replaced by expressions of wonder and renewed hope. Here was the tool that shaped weapons for kings. Rooney wept openly as he ran his aged hands over the anvil's surface. "It is true," he whispered. "Every word of the old songs is true. With this, we can forge anew the axe of unyielding. With this, no darkness shall prevail against the craft of Durin's children." Already, the forges were being lit, their flames burning brighter than they had in years. The first piece to be placed upon the anvil was a fragment of the shattered axe of unyielding, its broken edges gleaming with hope of renewal. When the hammer fell, the sound that rang through the halls was not the simple clang of metal on metal. Something deeper. The music of creation itself. The song that had shaped the stars and given form to the world. In the days that followed, weapons of legendary power began to emerge from the forge halls. Blades that could cut through the darkest sorcery. Armor that turned aside both steel and spell. Axes that sang with the valor of their wielders. When the orcs of Gundabad next dared to test the strength of Durin's children, they found their dark magic useless against steel, blessed by the anvil of Tharin. But perhaps the greatest victory was not in the weapons themselves, but in what their forging restored to the dwarven people. Pride returned to their halls, songs to their lips and hope to their hearts. The old skills that had seemed lost forever were remembered and renewed. Young dwarfs who had known only defeat now stood tall with the knowledge that they were heirs to a craft that had shaped the very foundations of Middle-earth. "Drake Whisperer, they call me now," Gandalf mused to Shadowfax, as they stood upon a mountain ledge, watching the transformed landscape. Where once the iron hills had seemed shrouded in defeat, now they rang with the music of renewed purpose. Smoke rose from a dozen forges, but it was clean smoke now, carrying with it the scent of honest labor. "A pretty title," came Gror's voice behind him. The dwarf lord approached, but this was not the broken leader who had first greeted him. This was a king restored to his full majesty, his beard now braided with threads of mithril, and his eyes bright with purpose. "Both names shall be remembered," Gror said solemnly. "Drake Whisperer and Anvil Seeker. But more than names, Mithrandir. The tale itself shall live on. How wisdom and cunning succeeded, where strength alone would have failed. How courage took many forms, and how the greatest treasures are not always won by the sword." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching as the sun set behind the peaks of the misty mountains. Somewhere in those heights, Ur-Dagul brooded in its violent lair, nursing wounded pride and plotting vengeance that would never come. For the dragon had learned, as all creatures of shadow must eventually learn, that some things cannot be held by force alone. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Gandalf mounted Shadowfax and prepared to resume his eternal wanderings. There were other roads to travel, other sorrows to mend, other flames to rekindle in the growing darkness. But he carried with him the satisfaction of duty well done and friendship honored. The road stretched before him like a silver ribbon in the starlight, and the final wave to the dwarves of the Iron Hills, Gandalf the Grey rode forth into the night, Drake Whisperer, Anvil Seeker, friend to all who stood against the shadow. Behind him, the forges sang their song of renewal, and ahead lay all the paths of Middle-earth, waiting for the touch of wisdom and the gentle guidance of one who served the secret fire. It is said in the years that followed, when bards sang of the deeds of Gandalf the Grey, they would tell of many great works, of his role in the War of the Ring, of his struggle with the Balrog, of his part in the downfall of Sauron himself. But among the dwarves of the Iron Hills, no tale was more treasured than that of the night when cunning and ancient song succeeded. The anvil of Thrain was restored to its rightful place. Thus ends the tale of the Shadow on the Forge, as it was told in the halls of the Iron Hills, where the anvil of Thrain sings still. The memory of Gandalf burns bright as a forge fire in the hearts of all who love wisdom above strength, courage above conquest.